Hey guys, so in this video, we're going to be covering a little bit of understanding unit rate and also diving just a little bit into equivalent ratios. I don't want to get too far into that because we do have a specific lesson. I think it's like lesson 3 for math in iReady that actually goes into equivalent ratios, but I want to touch on that just a little bit because I feel like you need somewhat of an understanding of what equivalent ratios are and how to use them in order to understand even the second lesson here, the second chapter. So this is lesson 2 from iReady. Now I kind of took a couple of pieces from the textbook and made it to where I can kind of condense it into this about maybe 10 to 12 minute video because I didn't want to do the whole lesson on this. So we're going to go and jump into it. I've got some notes here, so you see me look off to the side. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm staying on course. In my last video, I made mention of like how to write the ratios, what forms to write ratios, and I just kind of like skipped right over that. I mean, I did cover it in that video, but I want to make sure that I don't skip over anything important. All right, so at the beginning of this, we're just going to go and start looking at it. So this right here, I'm going to go and grab my highlighter. It says that ratios, rates, and unit rates are all comparisons. They compare one quantity to another quantity. And by now, you've probably learned that in class. You've learned different examples that your teacher gave you on how ratios are. So here's the definition of it from our textbook. A ratio compares to any two quantities, right? So you can compare boys to girls in a class. You can compare how many kids bring their own lunch to school compared to the number of people or number of students that eat lunch in the cafeteria. There's ratios all over the place, right? And we don't even realize it. So a ratio compares any two quantities. And in this specific situation here, it tells us Yolanda uses 4 cups of nuts and 2 cups of dried fruit to make trail mix. So it says here we can use a tape diagram to show this comparison. So I'm just going to quickly highlight that really quick. So let's go and take that definition of ratio first, right? A ratio, like we said, compares any two quantities. So by now we should be okay if you were to see on a quiz or a test that asked, what is the ratio of nuts to dried fruit in this problem here? And you should be able to come here and look, okay, so I've got these 4 cups of nuts here, and I've got these 2 cups of dried fruit. So therefore, the ratio of nuts to dried fruit would be 4 to 2. And it actually says that down here in the bottom part. It says the ratio is 4 cups to 2 cups or 4 to 2, right? So notice that the quantity of nuts is double the quantity of dried fruit. Now, that's just for this particular ratio here. So that's the simple definition and how to actually use a ratio question. So if you ever get a question that asks you or tells you to write this rate a ratio, as long as you remember, you keep it in the order that they're asking for. They wanted nuts to dried fruit, so I made sure to write the number that's associated with the number of cups of nuts, and then the number that is associated with the dried fruit. So just make sure you're keeping the order how they actually want it. Now here, let's look at this. I'm gonna grab a different color highlighter. At the bottom, it says a related rate is an equivalent ratio that compares the first quantity in a ratio to only one of the second quantity. All right, so I'm going to highlight that. That's pretty important. So a rate is an equivalent ratio. So that's why we're going to talk just a little bit about equivalent ratios that compares the first quantity in a ratio to only one of the second quantity. And I've only highlighted certain parts of that definition. So anytime you ask for a rate, you are asking for an equivalent ratio, which if you remember what equivalent fractions are, that should be helpful. I will show you in a little while how that relates to equivalent fractions. So you're taking the original ratio here. All right, so in our case, I'm going to write this as a fraction too. So remember, we have 3 forms that we can write ratios. This is what I meant to say last time. You got fraction form, word form, and colon form. I'm going to write this in fraction form. So I've got 4 cups of nuts to 2 cups of dried fruit. So this is the standard ratio that we were given in the problem. Now, to write a rate, we want to compare the first quantity. Now, in this case, think about what would be the first quantity in this situation here. Think about our ratio. What did we want to come first in the situation? We wanted the cups of nuts. So we want to compare the first quantity to only one of the second quantity, right? So we only want to compare the cups of nuts to just 1 cup of dried fruit. So if I write this as an equivalent fraction, here's how this looks. So I've got the 4 cups of nuts here, and I've got the 2 cups of dried fruit there. I'm going to take a different color pen here. right? So that means I want to compare it to just 1 cup of dried fruit. All right, so this is where equivalent fractions come into play. Okay, so the rate for this particular situation, for this particular problem would be, so let's think about this. In equivalent fractions, we learned it in 5th grade for sure. I know we learned this in 5th grade. So if you want to get from this 2 to this 1 using multiplication or division, think, well, what could you divide 2 by to get you to 1? You should be thinking you divide 2 by 2. So I'm going to go ahead and divide this by 2. That brings that to 1, right? But remember, in the world of equivalency, whatever I do to the numerator or denominator, I have to do to the other one, right? So in this case, if I'm dividing the denominator by 2, that means I need to divide my numerator by 2 also. I got to keep it equivalent. So then 4 divided by 2 is going to give me 2. Now my rate, right? Because if we look back at the definition here, the rate is comparing the first quantity in a ratio to only one of the second quantity. All right, so we only want one of those. Well, I got that. I've got 1 cup of dried fruit. Now I know that the rate is 2 cups of nuts. All right, so let's look at this right here. I can actually come back here to the problem up here and see, okay, so for every 4 cups of nuts, I have 2 cups of dried fruit. But the rate could also say for every 2 cups of nuts, I have 1 cup of dried fruit here. So you can see how the rate is kind of related to the original ratio that we had. It's equivalent to it, much like equivalent fractions that you learned in 4th and 5th grade. All right. So that is pretty much the definition of ratio and rate. Now let's look down here at unit rate. I'm going to grab one more highlighter color. Let's grab, no, I think that one's too hard to see. Let's grab this blue one. All right. This unit rate down here. Okay. So the unit rate is the number. All right. So it's the number in a rate that's being compared to 1. Just going to highlight that whole thing. That's all important. All right, so it's the number in a rate that's being compared to 1. So if we go back to our original problem here with Yolanda, right? So here is the ratio right here. This is the rate, right? So we decided that 2 to 1 is the rate. Well, now in a unit rate, that's the number that's being compared to 1. So I've got the 1 right here. Okay, so I've got that 1 right there. What's the number that's being compared to it in this case? Well, that would be the 2. So for this particular problem here, the unit rate would be 2 cups of nuts to 1 cup of dried fruit. So the unit rate in this situation would be 2. So really quick run through before we actually look at a problem in this situation. Ratios are ways to compare 2 different quantities. So any 2 quantities, boys to girls in a class, teachers to students in a class, that kind of thing. So that's how you actually can use ratios to describe certain things that you see every single day. A rate is comparing the first quantity. So whatever you're comparing, boys to girls, teachers to students, or in this case, nuts to dried fruit, the number in the first quantity, right, compared to only 1 of the second quantity. So you got to follow the order of what the ratio wanted. In this case, the ratio wanted nuts to dried fruit. So in this case, I wanted to see how many cups of nuts I could have for only 1 cup of dried fruit. So I was trying to compare it to just 1 cup of dried fruit. So that would be the related rate there. And then the unit rate is just taking that number that's being compared to 1. In this case, we saw that this 2 right here was being compared to 1. Therefore, my unit rate was 2 in representing cups of nuts to dried fruit. Okay, so I do have a problem that we can work together that kind of shows this going on and takes a little bit of our prior knowledge too to actually get through this problem. Okay, so I'm gonna try to go through this kind of quickly. So if I move too fast, please make sure to go back and rewind. I just don't want this video to be more than 12 minutes long if it doesn't need to be. All right, so remember, when we're reading iReady problems, we wanna go through the 3-read model. So remember, we read it to understand it, make sense of the problem. We read it to look for important information, and then we read it to solve it. Now, for the time purposes of this video, I'm going to kind of forego those. We're just going to kind of look at the important information here together and then talk about it. All right, so it says a 10-pound box of apples costs $12.50. Write the ratio of cost to number of pounds as a fraction. Then find an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 1. write the rate and the unit rate to describe the cost of apples. Okay, so this takes not only the equivalent fractions from 5th grade, but it also kind of takes the powers of 10 from 5th grade. Let me see if I can show you what I mean by that. So first of all, let's make some sense of the problem. So the problem is about a box of apples and how much the apples cost, right? Okay. The second thing we got to look for is some important information. I need to know that the 10-pound box of apples costs $12.50. That's going to help me in the future. All right. Now, we also need to know what the question is asking us to do. First of all, it gives us steps. So this one's kind of simple. It's giving us steps to solve this one. The first thing we need to do is we need to write the ratio of cost to number of pounds as a fraction. So that's important. Let's go and highlight that. We want the ratio of cost to number of pounds as a fraction. And then the second step, I'm going to highlight this in a different color, it says then find an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 1. And if you remember terminology here, denominator is the bottom number in a fraction. Numerator would be the top number. And then finally, it wants us to, and I'll do this in green, write the rate and unit rate to describe the cost of the apples. All right, so this one has the ratio, the rate, and the unit rate all tied into this. So let's go ahead and quickly go through this really quick. So first of all, we want to write the ratio of the cost to the number of apples. I messed that up. We want to write the ratio of cost to number of pounds as a fraction. All right, so you should be able to do that on your own. You should know how to write the ratio as a fraction. So in this case, we've got the cost, which is $12.50. And I want to write that as a fraction, so over the 10 pounds. Now, if you're wondering, how did I know to put that over the 10? Remember, order matters in these ratio problems. This one wanted the cost first to the number of pounds second. All right, so that's why I put the cost as my numerator, because that came first. And then my denominator was the 10, the number of pounds. Okay, here's the next step. I've got that first one down, okay? Got it. Now I'm going to come back and look at my problem. It says, then find an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 1. Okay, now we know what equivalent fractions are. So I can actually come over here and do this. Remember, we want an equivalent fraction that already has a denominator of 1. So I'm going to draw my fraction bar, and I'm going to put a 1 down here. That makes it pretty easy to do right here because I know what denominator I'm going for. And it's really easy for me to think about, how can I get from 10 to 1 using multiplication or division? You should be thinking, I can divide 10 by 10, and anything divided by itself is going to go be 1, right? So that means if I divide this by 10, then in the world of equivalency, remember, whatever I do to my numerator or denominator, I've got to do to the other part. So in this case, if I'm dividing my denominator by 10, then we should also be thinking about dividing my numerator by 10 in order to keep this equivalent to each other. All right, so now I'm going to take 1250 and divide that by 10. Up here, I should get $1.25 is how much it costs for 1 pound of what are we talking about here? Apples? Yeah, for 1 pound of apples. All right, so let's look at, we're not done with the problem just yet. We wrote the first ratio as a fraction. Then we found an equivalent fraction with the denominator of 1, so I'll put a check mark there. Then finally, the last thing that we need to do is to write the rate and unit rate to describe the cost of apples. All right, so let's go and look at that really quick. The rate, remember, the rate is a quantity being compared to 1. So in this case, we could say it's $1.25 for 1 pound of apples. So that would be a rate right there. You could write that anyway. I chose fraction form. And then finally, the unit rate would be the number that's being compared to 1. In this case, the number that's being compared to 1 is the $1.25 here. So the unit rate would be $1.25. So things that we've covered in this video are the definitions of ratio, rate, and unit rate. So those are the 3 definitions that we covered this time. We even talked a little bit about equivalent ratios. We'll talk more about that in a future video for lesson 3. And then we came here and worked out an actual word problem that deals with equivalent ratios and unit rates and rates. So again, if you have anything that you need to go back on, just come back and fall back on this video. I will have another one that's going to be dealing with equivalent ratios. And that one I think is going to explain more in detail. This is more of like an introduction to what we're actually going to be doing. But until then, yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.